Welcome to Dr. Lottie Science with Soul. I'm Dr. Lottie and the host of this podcast. I'm a physician, medical intuitive, evidential psychic medium, international keynote speaker, and author of Med School After Menopause, The Journey of My Soul, an inspirational story about transformation, healing, and spirituality, which won first place in the category of spiritual leadership in August 2021 from Living Now Book Awards. This award recognizes truly world-changing books that contribute to positive global change. The inspiration for this podcast came from my own life experiences. As I have journeyed through life, it has taught me that we're part of a greater divine web of interconnectedness. I have walked the path of illness, healing, and transformation. After 2 near-death experiences, I became clairvoyant, clairaudient, and clairsentient, and was guided to attend medical school at the age of 54. We will be meeting with many different types of doctors, healers, as well as spiritual leaders, educators, and other inspiring souls in this podcast. It is my hope that you will gain information and create a path to healing your own life physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and bridge the gap between science and soul. If you are a person who understands the interconnectedness of mind, body, and soul, and would like to take one of my courses or work with me to create a path of healing your own life, please visit divinespiritualessence.com or drlottie.com. To stay up to date on future episodes and to help us reach a larger audience, remember to subscribe, review, and share this podcast, as well as subscribing to my newsletter at divinespiritualessence.com. Welcome to Dr. Lottie Science with Soul. I'm Dr. Lottie and the host of this podcast. Welcome back to part 2 of the interview with Dr. Raymond Moody. Dr. Moody is a best-selling author of 12 books, including Life After Life and Reunions, which have sold over 13 million copies worldwide. He has also authored numerous academic and professional articles on near-death experiences and the relationship of language to consciousness. Dr. Moody is the leading authority on the near-death experience, a phrase he coined in the late 70s. Dr. Moody's research into the phenomenon of near-death experience had its start in the 1960s. The New York Times calls him the father of the near-death experience. Dr. Moody is also a world-renowned scholar and researcher and earned his MD from the Medical College of Georgia and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Virginia. Dr. Moody has appeared 3 times on Oprah, as well as hundreds of other local and nationally syndicated programs, such as MSNBC, Grief Recovery, NBC Today, ABC's Turning Point, Donahue's Sally Jesse Raphael Show, Geraldo, and The Joan Rivers Show. Dr. Moody continues to draw enormous public interest with his groundbreaking works on the near-death experience and other transpersonal aspects of grief and the dying process. Dr. Moody received the World Humanitarian Award in Denmark in 1988. And was also honored with the Bronze Medal in the Human Relations category and the New York Film Festival for the movie version of Life After Life. So today, Dr. Moody is going to be discussing his latest book, which is, the title is God is Bigger Than the Bible, and we are going to jump right into this conversation. And that leads me to talk about your latest book. Your latest book is God is Bigger Than the Bible.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you.
And it's a fascinating book. The title in itself is fascinating, and it really caught my eye. And I read it so fast. I flew through that book. I always love to see, what you have to say. So first of all, what led you to come up with that title, God is Bigger Than the Bible?
Well, because of what I call Bible abuse. I'm from deep South, and they used to be nicely confined to there, but now they're all over the place. These idiots, in my opinion, who tell you, well, you're going to hell if you believe this, don't believe this. Or, that is just so disgusting and obnoxious. it's astonishing to me that in American society, we let these people who don't know essentially anything except what they were indoctrinated into in their puny little Bible colleges, they're telling the rest of us that we're going to hell. And so the main premise of this book is God doesn't care if you read the Bible or not. God is bigger than the Bible. And if you think that's an assertion that is obviously true if you think about it. You know, God is the being greater than which none other can even be conceived, right? And so the idea that a Bible, a human product, which was put together over several hundred years by human beings and then revised by various kinds of fanatics and ideologues who destroyed the people who had some different opinion about the Bible. And now what we have left over is supposed to be a spiritual guide for me? No way. I mean, I think, you don't need to read the Bible to love God. God is a matter of relationships. Now, by the way, I mean, I know plenty of people who have good spiritual lives, who have, who do use the Bible as their basis of guiding themselves through life. So that's fine. I know wonderful people like that. But the idea that unless you read the Bible, you're going to hell, that is just absurd, people. And we let these fanatics intimidate us. So what the Bible, God is bigger than the Bible is about, is looking at God from the perspective of your relationship with God. Not being religious, I didn't think much about God, but I've started hearing about God through all these wonderful people who had near-death experiences. And the God that they portrayed was not this kind of jealous, raging monster that many people who are called themselves Christians are, tell us about, but a loving, humorous, very wise being. And that's where, and then later on, after many years of this, I had a personal experience, a direct encounter with God. And I like to say, I pray to God every day. He's never said a word to me about the Bible or about religion. And, what he seems to be interested in more is my spiritual health and my relationship with other people and so on. So that's the premise of the book. And I'm glad you enjoyed it, because I really did enjoy putting that together. It took a long 15 years, I guess. I was working on that book, and just little by little. But it's meant to encourage people who are seeking a relationship with God, but who just get turned off by these funda Christians, as I call them, and who worship that moron Pat Robertson and his crew. It's just I was a comedian for a while. I wanted to be a comedian when I was a kid, and I actually did it for a while in the 70s. So humor is very important to me. And, I think that humor is another way of relating to God. I think a lot of the people with near-death experiences tell me that they were impressed in their life review with the loving humor that God brought to the situation of seeing their whole lives portrayed around them like that. So that's what the book is all about.
So I know in your latest book, God is Bigger Than the Bible, you talk a lot about relationships with God, and that you don't have to read the Bible to have a relationship. So can you elaborate on that?
Yes. I love logic and interested in logic pretty much all my life. And I was a professor of logic for a while. And it's so interesting to me that there are so many people whose main way of dealing with God or existing in or being in relationship with God is that they wonder about whether God exists. I mean, literally, there's some people whose their whole relationship to God has just arguing about or wondering about or trying to prove whether God exists. Okay. But as a logician, I could take about 30 minutes to an hour, but I could sit down and I could explain to you what it means to say that something exists, right? I could even show you how you symbolize it in logic. But when it comes to God, I give up. You know, what people are trying to do when they argue about whether God exists is that they're trying to draw a circle around God. Think about it. This concept of existence. And that's ridiculous. What I say is God is greater than existence itself. You can't contain God within the concept of existence, which is a very limited, it's basically a context setting device in language. So where I come in is, to me, God is a relationship. I have a relationship with God. If somebody asks me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? I say absolutely no, because number one, I, Raymond Moody, am a very limited human being. Any belief I could formulate about God would be bound to be mistaken and off base. Plus, when you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of the sentence is on the word exist, isn't it? But I say, God explodes the concept of existence. God is greater than even the concept of existence. So I think, you know, to me, those people are asking an endless question. I mean, just pointless question. What I say is I have a relationship with God. I pray to God. I've had a direct personal experience of the presence of God. As you know, just like the mystics of history say, I mean, there are no words. It's just, and Plato just tried to describe it. He said, it's not, you know, he said something comes down and sets you on fire. It's not anything intellectual. You know, and so I've had that direct personal experience with God, that the compassion, the love, the understanding, I mean, there's just no way you can put that into words. So I think people, it's as long as they're focusing on whether God exists, you know, I mean, those are endless things. You know, those are things that have been fought out since the beginning of Western thought, and they don't seem to be any closer to resolution. But if you have a relationship with God, then things happen that, I mean, it's pretty amazing. It's, you know, so that's what I say. It's all about relationships. And God, I think, participates in our interpersonal relationships with other people. I think God is always kind of an unacknowledged third party in every relationship you have with somebody else.
I could see that. It's a very philosophical approach to the concept itself. And in your book, you also talk about the nonsense. And in one chapter, God and Dr. Seuss, you talk about nonsense and how we love nonsense. And then, quote, how it is a reminder that the mind cannot comprehend God.
That's right. Many philosophers over the centuries, and more particularly the analytic philosophy, which began in Europe and Britain and United States in the early part of the 20th century, the thrust of that was that many of the great philosophical problems that have been intractable have been so because they really don't say anything intelligible. And so the idea of these analytic philosophers was that the notion of God is nonsensical. You know, we say, oh, omnipotent, omniscient, and you know, and those are not real concepts because your mind boggles, right? And so, but this has often been used as when you say, well, the idea of God is nonsense, that may sound like an insult or a way of saying that God doesn't exist. But to me, the statement that the idea of God is nonsense is a statement about the limitations of the human mind. What it means is that we can't put together an intelligible concept of God because of the limits of our minds. That's what I think it means. And many great religions have used nonsense, and the Christians have the glossolalia, which is the spontaneous utterance of nonsense syllables drawn from their own language, put together in such a way there are no grammatical structures and no meaningful combinations. And the idea of this is that it puts you in an ecstatic state, which I have experienced myself. You don't need to be in a religious environment or to have an ecstatic experience to get the speaking in unknown tongues started. But once you do start it and go on and on spontaneously, you do get these extraordinary ecstatic states of consciousness, which I can really easily imagine from my experience of it, that it could well make somebody more receptive to the presence of God. And also in the Zen Buddhists, the koans, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And which is a nonsense question, but it's designed to provoke the student to try to solve it by a logical means. But eventually, when they realize that's impossible, it sort of puts them over into a translogical or transcendental state. So, yeah.
It's fascinating your background with the medical training, and then the philosophy on top of it, and then all the research with the near-death experience. How did that early training in nonsense relate to medical school and then ultimately to coining the term near-death experience?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I was a fan of Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll when I was a kid. And you're too young to remember, but a lot of people my age remember a wonderful Disney artist named Carl Barks, who did the Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comic books when I was a kid. And he was also a great nonsense writer. So, and all of these things I began to realize when I was a kid. I was about 11 or 12. That even though people think of nonsense as something unformed and chaotic, and that actually nonsense is actually a more complicated mode of language than is ordinary meaningful language, and that there are multiple indeterminately many different types of nonsense, which is very counterintuitive. Common sense thinks that nonsense is something undifferentiated, right? But listen to these sentences. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave." You recognize that as nonsense. But now listen to this. "Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity." Nonsense again, but different from the first, right? Or listen to this. "That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county," which is nonsense again, but different from the other three. Or listen to this. "Hat thoroughly the if zooms how zest." That's nonsense too, but there's just, you can go on and on and on. And this is a whole dimension of human experience and human language that is very different from what common sense has told us about it. Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies. When I was a kid, doo-wop music was a combination of nonsense as the main line of the harmony plucked together with meaningful parts. Sha-na-na-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na, get a job, right? Or scat singing of Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, or playground rhymes. So, it's a very important aspect of life, but because people don't like the word nonsense, they ignore this. But when you put this all together, what this does is that you can teach people about how to think logically about nonsense. I am not, somewhat to my detriment, I'm not a salesman type, but I have this book here, Making Sense of Nonsense, where it was published by Llewellyn about 1.5 years ago. And what that does is that I have been working for many years training people in this new way of how to think about things that don't make sense. And one of the implications of this for the near-death experience work is that I realized 20, 30 years ago, that eventually somebody who's learned how to do this, how to think logically about nonsensical things, is going to have a near-death experience. And when they do, it will compel them, for reasons I want to go into, to talk about it in a different way. Okay. And so it's already happened. A very eminent scientist and artist who went to one of my seminars had some years back. Then he had H1N1. He almost died. He had his leg amputated from gangrene. He was in the hospital for 60 days. He had, as I recall, three cardiac arrests with near-death experiences. And when he was talking to me about this, his voice suddenly changed. And he said, and Raymond, he said, and while I was over there, he said, my mind went back to the nonsense seminar. And he said, I realized that what you're saying is true. He said, you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. And what this means is that we already have thousands and thousands of reports of near-death experiences that are articulated through the lens of Aristotelian logic, which it depends on literal meaning. And that makes it a travel narrative. I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I saw my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and I came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But just a minute. So they also tell us this did not take place in time, right? And it wasn't in space. But now just a minute here. What travel implies the concept of time and space. So something is wrong, right? That is nonsense to say that there's no time and space and yet I travel. But that's okay. When Lincoln was president, there was a very formal state ceremony. Everybody was together. I forgot what it was, but his part in the ceremony required for him to mount a horse and to lead the procession away from the scene. But when he got up on the horse put its own back hoof up and got it stuck in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around. And everybody was shocked into silence, embarrassed for poor Mr. Lincoln. But Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody just erupted into laughter and the tension was broken. But you think about it, it's nonsense to say that a horse could get on its own back by putting the stirrup and climbing the board. But you got to admit, it brings that very vivid image into your mind of that very thing. Now, somebody who is already understands how to think logically about nonsense, when they have a near-death experience, they're going to see why that is not an adequate way of formulating it, right? So they will move it into some other different mode of articulation. And then when we compare these two different kinds of accounts, that will point us toward the afterlife. Why? Everybody knows that it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri, right? But if you ever stop for a minute, how did they figure that one out? You can't put a odometer on a homing pigeon's leg and send it out. How did it know? Well, by the late 18th, 19th century, they understood that they had they knew that it was 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun, right? So when the Earth is here in the orbit, they very carefully measured the angles to certain nearby stars. Waited exactly 6 months later, they do it again, and you could see there would be a tiny little difference, right? That's how you calculate. Now we have an equivalent method for the afterlife. We know what it looks like through the lens of Aristotelian logic, which makes it a travel narrative and a literal travel narrative. But in the not too distant future, we're going to have other accounts of it articulated not just through Aristotelian logic, but also through logical principles of how you think about unintelligibility. And this is going to give us a whole new way of looking at it. So that's what's coming. That's, a great scientist one time said that science progresses by funerals, mainly. And I think it's probably the same with the afterlife. I mean, the parapsychologists have got to die out before this, there can be any sort of real. But there are ways to do it. There are ways to do it. Yeah.
And I know you also have, you established another project that was called the Final Words Project. So before we wrap
Yes.
up, can you just tell us about what is that about? And
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier about how the nonsense thing played out in my medical school career. I had already built my system of how different types of nonsense when I went to medical school. So as soon as I got on the wards, I quickly realized that people with all kinds of illnesses talk nonsense involuntarily. People who are delirious, for example, just go on in a very specific type of nonsense, or people who are intoxicated with mercury or certain other substances will talk nonsense, or people who are severely stressed, even if they're not ill or injured, will talk nonsense, or schizophrenics will make up meaningless nonsense words, and so on and so on. And so what I realized early in my medical career is that when patients talk nonsense involuntarily, they talk identically the same types of nonsense that Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and Shel Silverstein and others write deliberately. So nonsense is nonsense, whether it's deliberate or involuntary. And so it's, most people, going by common sense, if this is the level here of ordinary meaningful language, sure, you can see that most people think of nonsense as something down here, right? That it's sublinguistic. But in reality, once you think it through, you see that nonsense is something superlinguistic. It's something that it's an extension of ordinary meaningful language. And that is the fundamental insight that anybody needs if they really are serious about getting genuine rational investigation of the afterlife started. They've got to make that realization. Then it all unfolds quickly from there. Once you get the few principles, you see where it's leading, but it's not, people are just very intractable about their old ways of doing things. So it's making inroads in a lot of places, but it's not going to, I think it'll be a while before this really catches on with a larger public.
mm-hmm. Yeah, you hear stories about how when people are getting close to death and they may only have a day or two to live,
right.
And how relatives tell stories about, I know my own mother-in-law told me a story how when she was at her father's deathbed and he was pretty much in a coma, and all of a sudden he sat up and he was speaking to someone at the end of the bed. And, and it was his old friend from childhood. And he said, wow, I can't believe you were here. And he had this whole conversation. And then he just lied back down and went back into his coma. And
I've seen it so many times.
And it's fascinating.
I guess you have too. It's just amazing. And when I realized, a lot of my professors would give me the terminally ill patients because they understood that I, was comfortable with that. And I just heard that constantly, that in the last few days or hours of their lives, people talk nonsense. But it's like, since you can look at the different types of nonsense, you can actually it's a whole new way. And my friend Lisa Smart has done work on that and gathering lots of final words, as she calls them, of people who are in the final phases of life.
Right. And they can have these experiences as well. It makes me think of one of my childhood friends that I grew up with. And she told me that when her mom was getting closer to death, it was a couple of months before she passed away. But she told my friend, her daughter, that she had this experience where she left her body and she met the people on the other side and spirits and family members. And they said, it's not your time yet. You have to go back and you need to put your papers in order. And so she did. And she said, my time is coming and I have to put all this paperwork in order. And sure enough, a few months later, it was her time.
Yeah, that is the collective experience of, I guess, unless you got a heart of stone, people who deal customarily with terminally ill patients. These are just things you see. I mean, it happens all the time. And one of the most uncanny ones is that in the final process of death, people light up. I mean, it's not light coming from the sun or from the light fixture, but so the deathbed scene is just, an astonishing array of amazing occurrences.
Yeah, it's fascinating. My mother also worked, she was a hospital floor administrator, and she was on a floor where there was terminally ill patients. And she would always tell us how, this patient that we've had for a very long time, I think the person is going to pass tomorrow, because today they were so alive and so vibrant. And it's the 24 hours before they would pass, she said it was just consistent how people would become more vibrant and more alive and glow, just like you said. And then it's like that.
It's amazing. It's like they may have been obtunded for 6 months, but they come back and they're not just like they were, they're more, it's more alive than alive. Sometimes what you have to say.
Yeah. Fascinating. And people can find out more about the Final Words account at finalwordsproject.org. And also you can find out more about Dr. Raymond Moody at his website, lifeafterlife.com.
That's right.
So I want to thank you again, Dr. Moody, for being a guest today. It's just been a delight to have you on sharing all your knowledge with the listeners. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Dr. Lottie Science with Soul. To stay up to date on future episodes and to help us reach a larger audience, remember to subscribe, review, and share this podcast, as well as subscribing to my newsletter at divinespiritualessence.com. If you are a person who understands the interconnectedness of mind, body, and soul, and would like to take one of my courses or work with me to create a path of healing your own life, please visit divinespiritualessence.com or drlottie.com. My book, Med School After Menopause, The Journey of My Soul, an inspirational story about transformation, healing, and spirituality, which won first place in the category of spiritual leadership in August 2021 from Living Now Book Awards, is available online at Amazon as well as other online platforms worldwide. If you are a person who understands the interconnectedness of mind, body, and soul, and would like to take one of my courses or work with me to create a path of healing your own life, please visit divinespiritualessence.com or drlottie.com.